Hey everyone, this is the Rewriter writing in. For today's video, we're going to be reviewing Deadpool and Wolverine, seeing if it was done right or in need of a rewrite. Now, this movie has been highly anticipated ever since the reveal of Hugh Jackman reprising his long-standing role as Wolverine for one last ride. But was it worth the hype? Let's get this intro out of the way and dive into the spoiler review of Deadpool and Wolverine. Before I dive into the positives and the negatives, I'll start with a brief synopsis of the film. So Wade is at a point in his life where he wants to belong to something greater, so he tries to join the Avengers, but he gets turned down. Now he takes this rejection really hard, and he ends up hanging up the Deadpool costume for several years until he's brought to the TVA, which is basically the Time Masters, and he's told that he could join the Avengers in another universe as his universe was coming to an end. Now Logan was the anchor point for his universe, so once he died, time began to turn on his world. But Mr. Paradox, who's the guy who brought Wade in, he turns out to be the bad guy who just wants to end his world quicker due to his hunger for power and control. So Wade recruits a Wolverine from another world to try and save his own. The plot here is very simple, but it's an enjoyable ride from start to finish. And since the plot is so light, this story is definitely a character-driven one. But truthfully, all three of the Deadpool movies have been character-driven stories, so it's not really a bad thing in my eyes. So now that we've briefly laid out the plot, let's start with the positives. Now, when people heard that the third Deadpool movie was going to be part of the MCU, they were understandably scared that they were going to make Deadpool 3 PG-13 and tone him way down. But I can say with full confidence that he has not been toned down at all and remains the unfiltered psychopath he always is. And the action here is as gruesome and gory as you would expect from a Deadpool movie, which was incredible. I mean, the opening sequence where he's using Logan's corpse to kill a bunch of TVA soldiers was hilarious and disgusting and awesome all at the same time. So huge props to Ryan Reynolds and his team for sticking up for Deadpool's R rating, as it's essential to the character, and losing that would guarantee audience frustration. So yes, this is a standard Deadpool movie through and through. You have nothing to fear. Now, both Ryan Reynolds and Hugh Jackman absolutely killed it in this movie as Deadpool and Wolverine respectively. These guys were born to play these roles, and it clearly shows with how good of a job they do. They have great comedic timing while also being able to deliver some of the more heartfelt scenes. I mean, Hugh Jackman is an institution at this point, as every portrayal of the character he's done has been absolutely phenomenal. And of course, Ryan Reynolds' Deadpool is incredible once again. Now, Wolverine's story in this narrative is simple but highly effective, as it's a story of redemption from selfishness that got his universe's X-Men killed. I love that they had him finally wear the suit, complete with mask near the end, which looked incredible, but that there was a meaningful reason behind it. It was a reminder that he was to be proud of being an X-Man, and wore it to honor their memory. This felt very in line with the cinematic versions of Wolverine that we've seen for over 20 years now, all crescendoing in this final movie, which felt like it fully wrapped up the character's arc in a satisfying manner. We'll get to Deadpool's story later, which I wasn't as much of a fan of. Now, a smaller point about the plot that I want to bring up before my last section is about the TVA themselves. While I don't typically like when the sequel to one film relies on you watching media outside of the films to understand what's going on, I thought that they did a good job at simply explaining the TVA and then moving past them to deal with the other issues of the plot, meaning that it still felt like a Deadpool movie. This is something that Multiverse of Madness should have done better, as watching the first Doctor Strange movie wouldn't help you in the slightest in understanding the sequel, as you would have had to have watched WandaVision, which actually had nothing to do with Doctor Strange anyway. That whole fiasco was a case of terrible writing, and I'm so glad Deadpool and Wolverine didn't do this. Now, my last positive that I want to talk about is the cameos, which in truth, I'm a little more mixed about than going fully positive. Now, I'll talk about my gripes that I have with the cameos later, but for now, let's stick to the positives. All of the cameos that they had were awesome, and it's always great to see legacy characters getting their chance to shine again. There were a lot of cameos, so I won't list all of them for fear of missing any of them, but know that they were so fun to see. My favorites were Blade, Johnny Storm, Gambit, and X-23. They kicked some serious butt here, and it was so cool seeing Chris Evans reprise his role as Johnny, which I felt that he absolutely nailed back in the day. The fact that he played two very different characters and ruled at both of them is really impressive. And the banter between all of the characters was very funny, especially between Gambit and Deadpool, since Gambit had such a weird accent. And seeing Blade in action once again was so awesome, and when he dropped the line about him being the only Blade, the theater erupted in cheers. And they couldn't not bring in X-23, she's too important to the Wolverine character, even if it's not his Wolverine in particular. Now, one thing that made me very relieved was that in the final fight sequence, a giant monster rushes towards them, but Deadpool and Wolverine are able to escape to a different universe, leaving the rest of the team behind. I thought it would be really lame for Laura to go through everything she did in Logan just to die in some wasteland in space. But then she came back and joined their little family in the end, and I was really happy to see that. I was so glad that they didn't just kill her off in some meaningless way. So, a lot of positives. There was a lot I liked about the film. But now let's transition over to the negatives. And I want to start with the first major issue that I had with the movie, which was Deadpool's story and the main villains. Throughout the two Deadpool movies, Wade had been building up a group of close ones, ending the second movie with a small family of people that he cared the most about. He was basically a member of the X-Men too, even though he didn't want to be labeled as one. So it doesn't make sense to me at the start of this movie why he's longing to be something greater, wanting to join the Avengers. He already found his sense of belonging in the first two films. Why does he feel like he needs to belong somewhere where his friends aren't? I feel like they just did this because they could, now that Deadpool is an MCU character. But it doesn't feel authentic to the character that they have established. It just makes him look kinda pathetic to me. He should be grateful for the friends that he has, yet he would rather be with people who don't care about him. It's just kinda stupid to me. And Mr. Paradox was a super lame villain who had no presence in the story, with a super flimsy and overplayed motivation, that of domination. But he's not even threatening enough to warrant this aspiration anyway. Now, I know that Cassandra Nova is the true main villain and that he was more of a nuisance, but even she wasn't that interesting either, as she basically had the same motivation as he did, to dominate the multiverse. It was cool that she was the twin sister of Charles Xavier, but that's about as far as her interestingness takes her. I just felt that the villains were super generic, and I never felt that the heroes were unable to stop them. Now, to be fair though, none of the Deadpool movie villains have been standouts for incredible villain writing. They're all pretty standard by the book villains, so I can't fault them too hard on this aspect. Now, another aspect that I don't really care for is the setting. I get that they're basically on a dumpster wasteland of a planet out in the far reaches of space and time, but it's just too generic of a setting for my taste. With the introduction of the multiverse, there's no end to the awesome locations that they could have gone to, but they stuck to a bland environment. And it's kind of funny because once Johnny Storm was killed, Wade made a joke about him costing a lot of their budget, and with the amount of cameos that they had, I really do think that a lot of the budget went to them instead of to cool settings. Now, it's not a huge criticism or anything like that, but I didn't really care for that aspect too much, which is why it's in this section. Now, really my last major gripe is with the cameos themselves. Now, while I did say that it was cool to see them, and Wade himself made a point that there would be gratuitous cameos, I still felt that they were mostly here for nostalgia and nothing more. Like Elektra, Blade, Gambit, and Johnny Storm, who all helped them in one way or another, had nothing to do with the Deadpool character, at least this version of the character, and therefore added nothing to his story or the overall narrative. Now, Sabretooth would have been a cool cameo for Logan had he not died 2 seconds after he was introduced. Now look, I'm all for cameos, but I prefer them to actually have some substance for the plot, people who add to Wade's or Logan's stories, like X-23. Again, while she didn't go through the whole Logan story with this version of the character, it was still impactful to see them together and for her to talk about how Wolverine saved her life and gave her a chance to live a somewhat normal one. I would have preferred the cameos be people like Cyclops and Jean Grey, people who Logan would be deeply impacted by. As much as cameos are cool, I'm getting tired of them using these great characters as nothing more than vehicles for fan excitement. And while that army of Deadpools was funny and made for a great action sequence, it again is brought in for fan hype and for very little more. So we've looked at some of the positives and the negatives, and now it's time for my final score. Now, while I do have some serious gripes about some of the major aspects of this film, overall, I believe this movie to be done right. It's a great summer action film that has amazing comedy, some really good heartfelt moments, and incredible action. And yes, while there were definitely things that they could have tightened up, especially Wade's story, I knew that Wolverine's story would be more prevalent than his, so I can't say that I'm shocked. It's not a perfect movie, but it's a far better one than most of the slop that Marvel's been peddling out for the past several years, although Guardians 3 was an incredible movie too. So those are my thoughts on Deadpool and Wolverine. Have you seen it yet? What did you think of it? Do you agree or disagree with me? Let me know all about it in the comments section below. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you enjoy the content I put on this channel. Thanks for watching everyone, and this is the Rewriter, writing out.